Hey guys, it's Riley with another all-English episode. I'm doing this one solo, and I thought that because last time I talked about the regional differences in Japan, at least how I saw them when I traveled around the country. So I thought this time I would do kind of the same idea, but for the United States. And now I have, I think, a better understanding about kind of the general idea of stereotypes that like American people have of people from each region. So I'll be including that kind of like general idea as well as maybe my own opinion a little bit. Whereas with Japan, I don't have that much of an idea what everyone thinks, so I had to go almost entirely based on kind of my own thinking. But this time I'll try to include the consensus opinion, I guess you could say. The real stereotype that kind of everyone, or many people, have. Now, that being said, obviously I know that individual people are different and are unique, so the kind of stereotype does not apply to everyone from a certain area, right? So if I say, oh, the people from the South are this way, that doesn't mean necessarily that the one guy from Georgia, the one American guy that that you met one time, has to be like that, of course, right? Yeah, but I just wanted to say that to kind of make sure everybody's on the same page. But yeah, I guess that's it for the kind of front matter. So Instagram, mine is Riley Sullivan XD. I'm still working on starting a kind of English-focused Instagram. I'm kind of getting bogged down thinking of a title or name, I guess, for that account. If anybody has any good ideas, feel free to send me a message on my current Instagram. And then Sota is Eigo no Sota. Yeah, and I think I'll leave it there, and let's get to the episode. Okay, yeah. So when we're talking about regions in the U.S., I think we're going to talk about, about 4 regions? Is that what we're going to do, I think? Yeah, I mean, the U.S. can sometimes be split up into more than just 4 regions, and there are obviously arguments about where one region ends and another begins. Maybe a little bit like Japan and Kansai. I think there might be some arguments about whether some prefectures are in Kansai or not, or Kinki, and if there's a difference between Kinki and Kansai, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. There's a lot of stuff like that in the U.S., especially, I would say, with 2 regions called the Midwest and the South. I think those two, probably more than other regions, have some debate as to what exactly the borders are. But anyway, I think for probably most people listening, it doesn't matter too much if this state is if one state is considered a part of the Midwest or not. So maybe we won't have to worry too much about that. But I'm not going to start with either of those 2 regions. I'm going to start with the Northeast, as it's called, which includes kind of 2 smaller regions. One of them is the New England, but I'm going to include New England in the Northeast. So New England would be like what? Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and maybe Connecticut is included, I think. And then the rest of the Northeast would basically be New York and New Jersey. Maybe parts of Philadelphia are included. Pennsylvania. Philadelphia is a city. Pennsylvania are included. So those kind of states. Some people might include Maryland and Delaware in there too. Maryland is one of those states, my state, that is kind of borderline between the South and the Northeast. But anyway, I don't think I'm forgetting any states there. Let's get into some stereotypes. So this is one of the oldest parts of the U.S. And kind of historically, a lot of the biggest cities in the U.S. are in this region. So New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore are some of kind of the big cities in the Northeast. Some people might even say Washington, D.C. is in the Northeast. It's, again, kind of border with the South, I guess, but culturally maybe more like the Northeast than the South, especially nowadays. So because of all these big cities and kind of this old feeling to them, the people in these regions are often thought of as kind of rich, or snobby even. Worldly might be a positive word to use, because a lot of these places have a lot of immigrants, so there's a lot of kind of different cultures that get mixed together, so people from this region might be more familiar with, foreign food or foreign music or things like that than other parts of the U.S. Also, in a lot of these big cities, there's big museums and cultural events, performances, so people from New York or Philadelphia or Boston might have a better understanding of, high culture, you might say. You're more likely to find an opera fan in New York than in Atlanta or something, I'd say. At least the stereotype would say so. Stuff like opera or, art films or stuff like that is maybe more kind of like Northeast coded. It's more like the Northeast, or people from the Northeast would probably like it more. It's also thought of as a very expensive area. I mean, New York especially is quite expensive to live. And it's liberal, meaning that people in this area tend to vote Democrat more than Republican. Although that kind of depends on the area. There are kind of countryside areas in the Northeast, like northern New York State, outside of the city, that might be a little bit more Republican. But for the most part, this area is thought of as being liberal, Democrat. And what else? I guess also there's some kind of rude stereotypes, especially about New York, that people in New York can be rude. Maybe there's something similar about Tokyo in Japan, although in Tokyo I usually hear it described as cold rather than rude, where the people are kind of like too busy to talk to you, too busy to help you, or something like that. I think in New York there's this, it's kind of true in that on the outside, people are not going to go out of their way to help you or to make small talk, have a casual conversation with a stranger. That doesn't happen too much in New York. But at the same time, if there is someone in trouble, I think New Yorkers, or people in the Northeast, maybe I should say, are still, going to help. I'd say... Oh, another one maybe I should mention is in the Northeast is where there are some of the strongest accents in the U.S. Again, because it's kind of an older part of the country. Older meaning, people from Europe came there first, basically. They came to the Northeast first, and the South. And each state in the Northeast, or many of them, had kind of different cultural identities. People from different parts of the UK especially, but also Europe, moved there. So the accent can vary a lot. There's a difference between a Boston accent and a New York accent and a Philadelphia accent. I can't really do any of them too well. If you want to hear a Boston accent, the movie The Departed is a pretty famous one, or, almost anything with like Mark Wahlberg in it. Those kind of movies you can hear a Boston accent. A New York or New Jersey accent you can hear from a lot of like gangster movies. Maybe Goodfellas has a lot of New York accents, or The Sopranos was a TV show from the early 2000s, late 90s, that has a New Jersey accent, which is not too different from a New York accent. Philadelphia. I don't know if there are any great examples of Philadelphia accents in media that I can think of. But but there's a TV show, Always Sunny in Philadelphia. I don't think any of the main characters have strong Philly accents, but maybe some of the supporting characters do. Anyway, if you just like YouTube Philly accent or Philadelphia accent or New York accent, you can probably find something. You can definitely find something. But I've been talking a long time about the Northeast. Maybe it's because it's the one I spent more than half my life in, so it's an important one to me. Next, I'll move to the Midwest. That's the place where I spent about the other half of my at least childhood. So I was born in Chicago, which is in the Midwest. I don't know, it doesn't officially have a capital, but you could maybe say that Chicago is the capital of the Midwest. It's the biggest city. But the Midwest probably goes from, you say, Ohio-ish in the east, all the way to, depending on how you count it, maybe Nebraska in the west. So the Midwest is a pretty big area, and it probably goes from like North Dakota, Minnesota in the north, down to like Kansas or something in the south. So it's basically the whole middle of the country from Canada to almost Texas, I guess, Oklahoma, I guess. And yeah, it's a big area. It's mostly flat. There's not really mountains in the Midwest at all. And so it's pretty famous for farming. There's a lot of farms. There's not a lot of big cities in the Midwest. I mean, Chicago, Indianapolis, like Cleveland or Columbus in Ohio. But those are all kind of in the northern part of the Midwest, northeastern part too. In the southwestern part, you get what's called the Great Plains, which is basically a huge area of just flat, basically farmland. So because of that, it has a reputation for being kind of boring, the people there, but also I think for being very salt of the earth. Salt of the earth is an expression that it basically means like real. The people aren't pretending to be anything they're not. They're just kind of simple, reliable, trustworthy people, I think is what salt of the earth tends to mean. Yeah, I think there's a lot of, I don't know, yeah, boring is a pretty strong feeling. But, you know, places like Chicago for a long time was the second biggest city in the U.S. I think nowadays L.A. is bigger, so Chicago's maybe third. But, you know, even though there's this boring stereotype, there's a lot going on in Chicago, at least, and in some of those other cities that I mentioned. The Midwest is also kind of a big sports area, I would say. People like their sports in the Midwest. Obviously, football is a big sport, but there are some sports that aren't so common in other places, like high school sports. High school wrestling or university wrestling is a big deal in the Midwest, especially. And maybe hockey is more popular in the Midwest than in many other parts. Ice hockey, that is. More popular in the Midwest than many other parts of the U.S. Might also be popular in New England or upstate New York. People also like hockey, but outside of the Midwest and the Northeast, hockey is probably not so popular, at least as a sport that people actually play instead of watch. Okay, moving on to the South. Yeah, so the South has anywhere from, some people might say Maryland. Most people would probably agree Virginia is in the South. Everyone would say Virginia is in the South. So from Virginia to Florida over to probably Texas in the West. And it's another kind of big area that has a lot of differences. I think there's a pretty big difference between people who are from Virginia and people who are from, let's say, Alabama or even Texas. There's kind of different versions of the South. And Florida is kind of its own thing. Florida's a little bit, some of it seems like the South, I would say. Weirdly, the northern parts of Florida are probably more like the South, but some of the southern parts of Florida, like Miami, are a little bit more Caribbean, because a lot of people from Cuba or Puerto Rico or places like that move to Miami, so it has a little bit more of this kind of Spanish flair, I guess you could say. But outside of Florida, you have the Appalachian Mountains, which is where, like, West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, that part of the country, and you get a lot of, like, old American culture there. So kind of like country music or bluegrass music, the banjo, a lot of that kind of classic American music comes from this part of the country. Also, that part of the country was famous for coal mining coal. I guess technically it still happens, but not so much anymore. But because it doesn't happen that much anymore, that area is also known for being very poor. But if you go toward the ocean side, the east side of the South, you get a lot of beaches. Myrtle Beach in South Carolina is pretty famous for being like a vacation area. Obviously, Florida has beaches, and some parts of like Alabama have nice beaches as well. Now, whereas I said the Northeast, it has a stereotype for being liberal Democrats, the South has a reputation for being Republican. Conservative is another way to say it. Some people would say that people from the South are racist. I think some people from the South are racist. But I think, that one's a pretty strong one to say all people from the South are racist. But, obviously that comes from the fact that the South, in the Civil War 150 years ago, the South had, black people as slaves. Nowadays, I don't think there are very many people that support slavery anymore, but I think because of that time in history, and also because of some Republican political ideas, people still consider the South to be kind of racist. At the same time, the South is often considered very nice and polite and warm. My mom actually moved to the South, to North Carolina a few years ago, and more than anywhere else I've lived in my life, if you're going on a walk outside, just in the neighborhood, everybody will say hello to you. Everybody will say, hi, how's it going? Now, that doesn't mean that they want to necessarily start a whole conversation, but everyone at least will say hello, which is interesting to me. So, there's kind of different stereotypes about them being both racist and also nice are two stereotypes that the kind of the South has. And then anyway, going into the West. So the West is, a large part of the United States, probably most famous in like California. That's kind of the main cultural area of the West, but there's also the Rocky Mountains, so that's like Utah and Colorado. And then there's the Pacific Northwest, which is like Washington and Oregon. And then there's like what's called, I guess, like the Sun Belt or the Southwest, which would be like Arizona and New Mexico. And these places are all a bit different, but they're all called the West. Especially California has a reputation for being having good weather, right? For being warm or comfortable, kind of all around the year. But a little bit east of California, like New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, a lot of that area is desert, so it's just hot all the time, hot and dry. And then you have the mountains, Colorado, Utah, and up north in like Wyoming, Montana, that are, often cold in winter. There's good skiing over there. And then Pacific Northwest, it rains a lot. There's mountains up there, but it doesn't get as cold, and it's a lot of rain. Now, some stereotypes with the West involve like cowboys. You know, if you've ever seen kind of a Western film, often it will take place in like Nevada or Arizona or something like that. Colorado, maybe, whatever. So yeah, there's kind of that cowboy stereotype. Farming is, in California, there's a lot of farms, but in a lot of the rest of the West, instead of having like a farm, people might have a ranch. So it might just be a huge area of land where people keep like cows or something. And those cows just kind of walk around on the land and eat, the plants as they move around. That's what cowboys are for. Obviously, cowboys would kind of herd the cow, meaning that they would take the cows from one part of the land to another part so that they could find new stuff to eat. Some other stuff is like a lot of these states in the West were some of the first states to make marijuana legal. California, Washington, Colorado, I think were some of the first. And nowadays, I think almost all of them have marijuana pretty much legalized. So that's a stereotype. Especially Colorado, Washington, California are pretty, famous for having a lot of weed, marijuana there. Kind of opposite to that, though, is Utah. Utah is kind of the capital state for Mormonism. Or LDS, as it's more politely called, the Latter-day Saints. So if you've never heard of a Mormon or Mormonism, it's kind of a version of Christianity. Christians that started in the U.S. and they have kind of strict rules about what you can do and can't do. Like you can't drink alcohol or smoke cigarettes. You can't have any caffeine if you're a strict Mormon. So no coffee, no soda with caffeine in it, and stuff like that. And a long time ago, maybe 100 or more years ago, Mormon people used to have multiple wives. So one man would have 4 or 5 wives or something like that. So even nowadays, Mormons can be considered by other people as being a little bit weird, a little bit different. I actually had quite a few Mormon friends when I was in high school. And I can say from experience that they're extremely nice people, even if some of their beliefs or some of the ways they live are different from me. I don't know. I guess if we talk about politics, the West is generally pretty liberal, often vote Democrat, especially California, Oregon, Washington, the kind of the coast of the West. Maybe some of the inner areas like Montana, Wyoming, not so much, not as liberal. Obviously also there's the Hollywood thing, California is where a lot of the movies in the US are made, so there's kind of a whole bunch of stereotypes that go along with that, like being kind of fake is one of them, because a lot of people who want to be in movies are actors, right? So a lot of these actors kind of have to maybe pretend to be a certain way to be seen as, I don't know, cool or whatever, to fit in with these kind of movie people. It might be similar to New York in a way. I said that people in New York or in the Northeast can be snobby. I think there's a similar kind of snobbiness that comes in the West, but it's more related to I don't know, who you know in the movie industry or what movies you've been in or stuff like that. There might be a kind of snobbiness about that kind of thing. Now that's maybe limited to LA, basically Los Angeles only, not the rest of the West, but it's a kind of stereotype that maybe bleeds into other parts of the West because of the power, the cultural power of LA. Anyway, I'm going a bit long now, almost 25 minutes. So I'm sure that there's some stereotypes that I've forgotten or skipped, but I don't want to make this a 30-40 minute episode, so I think I'll stop there. If you guys have any comments or questions about different regions, different stereotypes, maybe you heard something from an American friend or you saw something on a movie or in TV, feel free to message me about it. I'd love to hear your questions. And that'll do it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.